Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the box model, which explains how elements are displayed on the page, specifically using margin, border, padding, and the actual content of those elements. So here we have two paragraphs. I'm a paragraph, and I'm another paragraph. And then inside of styles.css, we've set a few properties. We have a margin of 24 pixels on the paragraphs, a padding of 10 pixels on the paragraphs, and a border with 2 pixels of solid black. And then we also have this background color of light blue. So we can come over to the actual output and we can see that we have our two paragraphs. There's some space between them. There's also some space between the content of the paragraph and that black border. So what's actually happening here? We can see in the Chrome Inspector we have our two paragraphs, and if we hover over both of them, we can see the values. And if we look at the bottom right of the styles panel, we can see all of the different values that we have set. So in the middle here, we see the actual content, and this gets highlighted in the output as well. And you can see this sort of just wraps the content of the paragraph, and this goes all the way to the end of the element because this is a block element. So it is filling up the entire width of the parent, which in this case is the body. And then directly outside of the content, we have that padding. And the padding is 10 pixels on all sides because that's what we set in CSS. And this is space in between the content and the edge or the border. So this space is sort of like it's inside of the content in the sense of the background is still there. So this still gets the blue background color, but it is outside of the content. It's just before the border of the content. And then we have the border, which is that 2 pixel solid black that we set. And finally, we have margin, which margin is the space that an element says, this is the minimum space I want between me and other elements. And I say the minimum because one thing you might notice is that even though both of these paragraphs have 24 pixels of margin, they are only 24 pixels away from each other. Those margins aren't adding together. And the way this works is called collapsing margins. So with the vertical alignment, the margins will collapse, meaning we will just use whichever margin value is bigger. However, with horizontal margins, that actually doesn't happen and the margins will be added up together. So if these were next to each other horizontally, we would be adding the values rather than just taking the larger one. One of the first things you might notice here is that we've set the margin to be 24 pixels, and this is affecting every direction. However, we might want to only set the margin for certain values. We can see here in the inspector, if we go over to the paragraph tag, the margin has 24 pixels, and we can hit this little arrow to see all of the individual values. So margin is actually margin top, right, bottom, and left. So I'll disable this value for a moment and you'll see the paragraphs get a little bit closer together. There's still some margin because there's default margin coming from the user agent style sheet, which in this case is 1 EM. However, let's go back up to the paragraph, and what we can do is say maybe all we want is margin bottom. And we want this to be, let's put something pretty big so it's easy to see, 48 pixels. And now you'll see this is essentially pushing the element below the first paragraph down. Or the other way we can define these is we can say margin, and then we can do one at a time. So I could say top might be 48 pixels, and then we go right, and maybe I want right to be 24 pixels. And then we do bottom, and maybe I don't want any bottom margin, so I'll do 0. And then we can do left margin, and let's say I want just 10 pixels on the left. And again, what this does is top, right, bottom, left. It goes clockwise, starting from 12 o'clock, and you can see those same values if we open this up. We can also define this as just vertical and horizontal. So for example, I could say 48 pixels, 24 pixels. And what this says is 24 pixels of right and left, and 48 pixels of top and bottom. Finally, we can also use a value of margin auto. And what margin auto does is it essentially just allows the browser to sort of make a decision, and most of the time this will default to be 0. So you can see with margin auto, these paragraphs are essentially touching each other. But what we can also do with margin auto is use it to center elements. So if I come to this paragraph again, we can add a width of say 30%, and you'll see the element is actually centered. However, if we get rid of margin auto, the element will not be centered. It goes back over to the left. So a lot of times you'll see something like 24 pixels space auto to say we want 24 pixels of vertical margin, and then we just want to center the element. And that's a good way to get a very easy, simple layout that works very well. Finally, there's one more trick with margin that we can play around with, and that is to set a negative margin. So I'll go ahead and disable these as well. And let's add one more rule that's just margin left, and say negative 10 pixels. And what this is going to do, as you just saw, is it is going to shift the elements 10 pixels over to the left. So while margin generally pushes elements away, negative margin pulls it closer to the elements on the side of it. So in this case, just to the edge of the body. And when I disable this, you can see it moves back over to the right, and margin left negative moves it left again. We usually want to avoid using negative margins too much because it can create some weird effects in our layout, but they can be nice occasionally when you just need to shift something over slightly, and it's an easy way to go about doing that. Finally, let's take a look at this inline element. So I'm going to disable the margin left and move into this paragraph and look at this inline emphasis tag. So with this emphasis tag, let's set a margin and say 24 pixels. Now what you'll see is that the horizontal margin is working. It's pushing the text away, and the word paragraph actually even went to a new line because the paragraph ran out of space, but it's not making any vertical margins. It's not pushing anything vertically 24 pixels away from it. And when I highlight the EM, you don't even see that vertical margin. The reason being that vertical margins have no effect on inline elements. And this is true of padding as well, so vertical padding on an inline element does nothing either. And with that, let's go back up to the paragraph and talk about padding. Padding works very similar to margin, with the primary difference being that the space goes inside of the border rather than outside of the border. So padding's purpose is not to push the element away from other elements. Its purpose is to push the border farther away or closer to the content. And again, padding works exactly the same way. It has a padding top, right, bottom, and left, and we can set these values individually or using just the padding name. That said, one thing worth pointing out is that not everything works the exact same. For example, padding cannot take a negative value. So if I were to give this a padding value of, say, negative 10 pixels, it's just going to give me this little yellow warning to say that this is an invalid property. So I'll go ahead and change this back to 10 pixels and it will work again. And finally, let's take a look at how we can edit the border. So here you can see we have a border of 2 pixels solid black. We can disable that and the black border goes away. There's not that much to the border. The one thing to know is that you can set just one direction, just like you can with padding and margin. So I could say border top, 2 pixels, solid red, and you'll see we get this red border at the top, but there's no other border, and we could set different borders on different sides. So I could also say border bottom, 2 pixels, solid black. And now we have the black border on the bottom and the red border on the top. We can also set what we call a border radius, so border radius, and this allows us to add some curvature to the outside of the element. So for example, I could say 10 pixels, and we get a nice curved edge to these paragraphs instead of the sharp corners. Lastly, we can also set the border radius using a percentage. So I could say something like 50%. And since the radius of a circle is half of the diameter or half of the width, setting the border radius to 50% essentially says that we want a circular shape. And if this was actually a square, so if I changed the width to say 300 pixels and gave it a height of 300 pixels as well, you'll see that now we actually have an exact circle. And the reason for this is that the radius, again, is half of the diameter. So by setting the border radius to half of the size of the element, we are setting it to the exact length of the radius, which is creating a perfect circle. You will notice though that the text is actually no longer even inside of the circle. And the reason for that is that we still use the box model. Even though it looks like a circle, this is still a box. So if I hover over the paragraph, you'll see the shape of the content is still rectangular. We just have this border that is a circular shape. And because of that, the text is outside of that border. However, we could center the paragraph text using Flexbox or some other properties that we'll see later on in the crash course, and then get a effect where we have a circle with centered text inside of it. But anyways, for now, I will get rid of this border radius and we will go back to what we had. Let's get rid of the width and height as well and make this bigger once again. And finally, to recap, let's take one last look at the box model. So inside in the middle, we have the content. This is the actual content of our element. And then outside of the content, we have the padding. This is space between the element and the border. And background colors will affect this because the background color affects inside of the border. And then we have the border, which is the edges of the element. We can set the top, right, bottom, left all differently. We can also set a border radius to give rounded edges. And finally, we have the margin, which defines the space in between two different elements. With vertical spacing, this is going to be collapsed, whereas horizontal spacing, it will add the values together. And that's all there is to the box model. It's fairly straightforward, but it's also a very powerful way to lay out our elements. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.